Hello, I'm Joe, and big movies just ain't been hitting lately. I want to emphasize big because while 2023 was disappointing for the blockbusters, everything else is pretty dope. Past Lives was a beautifully heartbreaking look at small yet life-changing decisions. Blackberry was a hilarious tragedy, while The Iron Claw was just a straight-up tragedy. CZ was a blast, and Godzilla Minus One was a unexpected banger, or at least unexpected in the ways that it banged. There was a lot of good stuff that you simply may have missed. I'm of the firm belief that movies haven't gotten better nor worse in recent years. There's always been good movies and there's always been bad movies. We remember the great ones from the 80s, but if you look at the standard release schedule, there's a lot of garbage as well. So 2023 was like most years. There were plenty of great, worthwhile films. But when it comes to measuring the health of the industry, we have to look at the big ones, the blockbusters. And boy, I tell ya, it wasn't pretty. Outside of Barbenheimer, the flops outpaced the hits. When it comes to certified dubs, there was Creed 3, John Wick Chapter 4, Guardians Volume 3, the out-of-nowhere success of Sound of Freedom, Across the Spider-Verse, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, which was surprisingly good, and Super Mario, which apparently was a surprise success to Hollywood, which, it was an animated Mario movie made by Illumination. I don't know why anyone is surprised it made $1 billion. But outside of the movies I've listed, it was predominantly flops, which I do want to clarify is not always indicative of a film's quality. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 was technically a flop, even though it was a damn fine action film, one of the best to release last year. Additionally, Blue Beetle is technically a flop despite being the only good superhero movie outside of Spider-Verse and Guardians. But those were the anomalies, to be honest. Despite having some charismatic leads and a outright baddie in Anthony Ramos and Dominic Fishback, Transformers Rise of the Beast just didn't quite hit. The Flash bombed for obvious reasons, and Indiana Jones cratered unexpectedly. Fast X barely broke even. Heck, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, the launch of Phase 5, did absolutely no damage. There was Aquaman, Shazam, The Marvels, Exorcist, Expendables 4. Remember that? Haunted Mansion, Wish, Dungeons & Dragons, and while some of these happened during the actor strike, some were well before it, so a lack of promotion can't be blamed. So, what's going on here? Are people simply uninterested in movies these days? Is the art form dying? Is all that's going to be left in the future, or just TikToks and YouTube videos? No, it's not that people aren't interested in movies, it's just that the movies simply aren't that interesting. And the reason for that largely lies in the shift to corporate-driven filmmaking and all the ramifications that have come from it. But before we get into all that, we're going to take a brief trip through film history to get some context on how we got here. There is one thing I want to make explicitly clear off jump. Mainstream filmmaking, like everything else under capitalism, has always been about making money. Folks often like to bring up the 70s as the halcyon days of cinema, and while yes, the 70s is one of my favorite eras, and filmmaker-driven films are the ideal, those movies were getting made because people were paying to see them, not due to some, high-minded idealism about the craft. And like so many eras of film, seemingly including the one we're currently in, it ended due to budgets getting out of control and people just not showing up to the movies. The critical and commercial failure of Heaven's Gate wasn't the only reason that era ended, but it was endemic of the excesses and lack of financial gains that became common in its twilight years. The general failure of these films, combined with the successes of Jaws and Star Wars, laid the foundation of which the modern era was built. See, before those two, genre flicks by and large were considered B-movies. Schlock that'd be sent to theaters between the prestige releases. As we got through the 80s, the B films became the A films when we would transition into this era of producer-driven filmmaking. Patrick H. Willems did a fantastic video detailing how Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer spearheaded this era of films, minimizing the filmmakers' artistic control in favor of the producer's more commercial vision. And while it'd be easy to draw a straight through line from the 80s to now, there were some key differences between the producer-driven era and our corporate-driven one. While Simpson and Bruckheimer had struck on a simple, repeatable, and quite honestly effective format, they also understood that the movies had to, look good. At their peak, they were working with visual stylists such as Adrian Lyne and the late great Tony Scott. I mean, Days of Thunder is widely considered like the end of this era, and that film is gorgeous despite whatever flaws it may have. Sure, the plots can be cookie cutter, but they were effective, and you pair that with slick imagery that can't help but be visually satisfying, and you get a movie that, while not the most thematically dense, still provided some kind of sensory thrill. As we entered the 90s, it was kind of this interesting middle ground between the filmmaker-driven 70s and the producer-driven 80s. Indie films had become all the rage, with video stores helping make directors like Quentin Tarantino, Kevin Smith, and Robert Rodriguez household names. High-concept films, movies whose premise could effectively be summed up in a logline, became the norm, and these movies were directed by folks who, again, had very interesting styles, be it the Wachowskis, Ridley Scott, Michael Bay, Jean de Bont. Sometimes they were simple, sometimes they were complicated, but god damn it, they always looked cool. Yet as we entered the 2000s, that all started to change. Film studios started to become subsidiaries of larger and larger corporations. Now through the 80s, it wasn't uncommon for a conglomerate to buy a studio, get frustrated by the inconsistent returns on investment, and sell them off. Heck, Coca-Cola owned Columbia Pictures for a brief period of time before selling it off due to the costly bomb of Ishtar. In the 2000s though, the megacorp stuck around for better and mostly worse. Universal became part of NBC Universal, which in turn is a subsidiary of Comcast. Disney had effectively evolved from a film studio to a multinational corporation with cruise lines, theme parks, retail stores, you name it, they probably do it. Warner's was just like the corporate gang bitch being passed around from Time Warner to AT&T and now, unfortunately, to Discovery, and Columbia is owned by Sony, another megacorp. Now, corporations are not big fans of risk. They favor the predictable, consistent growth, steady earnings, no real fluctuation, which makes it incredibly weird they all got into filmmaking because, while yes, you can make a lot of money on movies, you can also lose a lot of money on movies. Success is rarely predictable. Heck, one of the most successful producers of all time, Jerry Bruckheimer, sums it up perfectly.
We think we know what we're doing, we really don't. And I don't care who you are. If you say you just made a hit movie before it hits theaters, you're lying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you don't know.
Yet it was at the end of the odds that the corporate ran system would stumble upon its guaranteed moneymaker. Franchises and reboots. Repeatable stories with familiar characters that audiences love. And no studio did this better than Disney. After acquiring Marvel and Lucasfilm, Disney got to work. The Marvel Cinematic Universe was in its early stages when Disney acquired it, and the gamble paid off dividends with the first Avengers movie. They also got to work doing live-action reboots of some of their old classics, starting with Alice in Wonderland in 2010. The MCU was an incredibly novel concept. By replicating the connected universe of its comic book source material, they built a franchise of franchises, some real Cosmere stuff. You'll watch the Captain America sequels both to catch up with Cap, but also to see how the movies would affect the larger MCU. The movies themselves largely were self-contained stories, with the post-credit scenes teasing what comes next. Instead of finding out a new Marvel movie was dropping by catching the trailer in a theater, they would hold massive fan events, either at Comic-Con or the El Capitan, announcing their whole slate of Phase 2 and 3 movies. This was both to stoke the hype of the diehards, but also to assure shareholders the gravy trade was gonna keep trucking. The tactic worked, as Marvel movies consistently grossed over $1 billion or came pretty darn close within striking distance, to the point that the grosses went from surpassing expectations to becoming the expectation. For reference, from Black Panther through Spider-Man Far From Home, the only movie in the MCU that didn't gross over $1 billion was Ant-Man and the Wasp, which still grossed over $500 million. But, as we learned in the last video, Hollywood is a town that learns the wrong lessons. So, it wasn't, let's carefully build cinematic universes piece by piece, brick by brick, getting audiences invested in these characters and the overarching storyline we have planned. Instead it was, yo, what if we made feature-length trailers for movies that may or may not come out, and like, let's be real, they're probably not gonna come out. In the rush to get that Marvel money, Warner, Sony, Universal all launched failed cinematic universes that failed to even come close to the critical and commercial success of their Marvel counterpart. Warner's used Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice as a way to will a cinematic universe into existence, and that movie was polarizing. Either you loved it or you hated it, and I ain't even gonna front, it wasn't for me, Chief, but we'll talk about that some other time. Sony used The Amazing Spider-Man 2 to hotshot its cinematic universe, resulting in a film where 30% of it felt like a sequel to The Amazing Spider-Man, and 70% of it felt like a trailer for movies that we would never get. Universal rather infamously tried to launch the Dark Universe with the Mummy reboot. The film flopped as the attempts to build a cinematic universe felt forced and the car story was just kind of boring, to be honest. As these franchises and event films went from occasional tentpoles to the only thing studios were interested in making, the stakes became higher. They no longer were interested in a base hit. They wanted home runs and they wanted them year round. See, back in my day, blockbusters were mainly reserved for the summer and winter months, where schools are out and you can get the maximum number of audience members in the theater. With the release of Batman v Superman in March, Deadpool in February, and the Fast movies in April, it was proven that you can make blockbuster grosses year round. So the mid-budget movie that many an upcoming filmmaker would use to solidify their style and gain experience working with larger budgets and crews was given the boot in favor of year-round tentpoles. You were either making micro-budget Blumhouse horror flicks or you're making big-budget blockbusters. There was nothing in between. And it is not a cheap endeavor to make a blockbuster. One tactic that every studio has employed now is getting indie directors with little experience and, more importantly, little clout to direct these films. And because these directors are inexperienced, they can justify taking a more producer-driven approach to the movies. Every now and again, you get a Greta Gerwig, a James Gunn, or a Ryan Coogler to come in and actually bring an authorial style to their films. Often, though, you get what happens with the Captain Marvel series. The directing duo of Anna Boden and Ryan Fleck, the directors of the first Captain Marvel, as well as Nia DaCosta, director of its sequel, have shown that they can make some damn fine flicks in the Indian mid-budget world. Yet, their Marvel films feel distinctly lacking in personality. They're not god-awful, like the more childish and hyperbolic corner of fandom will lead you to believe, but they're simply not that memorable. James Mangold is a phenomenal filmmaker, one of my personal favorites, and he has thrived in this space with his Wolverine films and The Slept On Night and Day. Yet when having to take on the mega-budget Indiana Jones, all the things that make his films great were curiously absent. And, if I can play armchair film guy, I think the biggest reason for this is that these things are just too damn expensive. If you're spending $200 to $300 million on a movie, you're gonna have some serious reservations about a director coming in and really doing their thing. Unless that's James Cameron, and yeah, he's got 3 of the highest grossing movies of all time. He's shown he can repeatedly bring a Billy. For everyone else, there's too much money on the line, and you cannot mess with the formula. A movie is only allowed to be so interesting when it costs the entire GDP of a small nation. Marvel got away with it for a decade because the approach they took was novel. We hadn't seen interconnected storytelling at that scale before. Over 20 plus movies, they managed to weave an interconnected story with each hero facing their own trials and villains, while a much larger threat mustered its forces in the background. The stakes were clear, the take was new, and god damn it, they managed to stick that landing. But post-Infinity Saga, Marvel's indulging in the same tactics that have derailed their competitors. Nostalgia for the sake of nostalgia, movies that sacrifice being interesting now to tease something coming later, and visual effects that looked so shaky you have to double check the budget. Now the last part of that is both due to the strain COVID put on the production pipeline, but also how that pipeline is built now. I'm a firm believer of building practical sets, shooting on location, and using miniatures to make the world building of genre film feel as tangible as possible. But sadly, that's not how most movies are made anymore. A large chunk of them are shot predominantly on green screens or now in the volume. By having as few tangible sets as possible, you're able to, as Some More News puts it, build a modular movie. You don't have to stick to any one choice. You can turn the desert into the Arctic and all you gotta do is tell the actors, hey, you're cold now. This means that scripts don't have to be 100%. You can start shooting and change it in post and do some reshoots. The problem with that method is that it takes time to make CGI worlds look believable. If you're constantly reshooting and having to digitally rebuild sets up to the release date, there's a slim chance it's going to look like anything better than your average cutscene in a video game. And when video games look as good as they do now, and tell stories as good as they do now, it's a little hard to want to spend $12 on just a bunch of CGI mush with a story that's not going to make me feel anything. And this problem is only compounded if you're adding in directors who are often working with the style of filmmaking for the first time and are putting their trust in the folks who know what they're doing, or at least say they know what they're doing. And the saddest part of it is, I sincerely believe that most of the folks working on these flicks are doing their best. Making anything, a movie, a short film, content for a failed relaunch of a mid-2000s gamer brand, is hard. And I ain't met anyone who steps up to that plate and goes, yeah, I'm trying to absolutely whiff it and piss everyone off in the process. Sure, a lot of folks are motivated by ego, and trust me, I've worked with a few of them, but there are plenty of people who sincerely want to make a banger, but the current structure just makes it incredibly difficult to pull off. I'd love to say I have all the answers, but I'm just a dude who watches a lot of movies and occasionally makes them independently. I'm really just talking about what I've observed as both an avid moviegoer and a person who just reads a lot of the trades and tries to keep abreast of the comings and goings of Hollywood, considering it's an industry that I kind of want to work adjacent to. But since you're here, I'll give you my opinion anyway. The clear solution to me, as an outsider, is a return to how things used to operate. The days of something like Pirates of the Caribbean 4 making $1 billion died with the pandemic and China's continued rejection of American films, which, again, we might talk about sometime. I think the best solution for now is increasing the risk while lowering the cost. Throw shit at the wall, make some weird-ass movies, go back to genres that have fallen by the wayside and come up with some fresh new takes. Stop with the remakes, or, you know what, better yet, remake movies that just didn't find their audience the first time around. We didn't need a Little Mermaid remake. It was perfect as is, but you know what? I'd take an Atlantis remake. I'd take a Treasure Planet remake. Movies that didn't quite find their audience and are expressly suited for live action and probably would be more generally accepted in live action. If you remake the classics, the best you're gonna get is okay, but you're never gonna top the original. As for superhero movies, don't abandon them, just make them interesting and scale back on them. I read a lot of comics, and I can tell you this much. Not every superhero story involves the fate of the multiverse as we know it. I see no reason why a mid-budget adaptation of something like Tom King's Strange Adventures or Avengers Arena couldn't work. Instead of making every superhero a blockbuster, treat it like a genre unto itself. Some heroes like Superman and Hulk need a larger budget by virtue of their power sets and villains, but something like Heroes for Hire or One Star Squadron could be really unique, lower budget takes and add something new to the genre. Additionally, when you're gonna spend the money on a big budget tentpole, deliver something new, something that demands to be seen at the largest scale possible. Use 3D, IMAX, 70mm, build sets, and when you use CGI, make sure the effects artists have the time and resources to execute their jobs at the highest level. Y'all have deadass made VFX artists the most important part of the process. They designed the entire effing movie, and yet you pay them garbage, you overwork them, and then you shift the blame on them when your movies don't look good. When it's honestly your shitty logistics that led to this. It's messed up, and I really hope VFX artists unionize and get the gains that they desperately need, because this situation is untenable for them. And all of this isn't just wishful cinephile talk. Barbie, Oppenheimer, Dune, and Avatar are all examples of the style of filmmaking I'm talking about and have resonated with mass audiences. I don't know if you can tell, but I love movies. Going to the movie theater has been my lifelong hobby. Even now, with releases being what they are, I still hit the theater regularly to see screenings of old movies I either wasn't alive or able to see upon their original release. My next few outings at the movie theater were for Gurren Lagann and Cowboy Bebop the movie. I want this method of exhibition to exist and thrive into the future. But in order for that to happen, studios have got to stop simply chasing the bottom line. They gotta, give folks a reason to care beyond simply existing, because there's so much now competing for people's time and attention. And a freaking 200 million piece of mid ain't gonna cut it no more. Especially when I can play God of War Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, freaking Fortnite. I'm genuinely interested to see how the studio system is going to try and bounce back from this rut they're in. They know there's a problem, and it's clear things are going to have to change, but it's going to take some time. They're basically big cruise ships, and a cruise ship can't turn immediately. It's going to take a long period of adjustment, and I hope these changes are positive and benefit the industry at large. But time will tell. So that's all I got today. I'll see you next week.